Good evening and welcome. My name is Michelle Horath, Assistant Dean for Diversity and Inclusion, and on behalf of the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy, I'd like to welcome you all this evening as we launch into week 2 of Black History Month at Harris. We are proud to host several events that will bring together prominent speakers, activists, practitioners, community members, and the University of Chicago's alumni, faculty, students, and staff. Our theme for Black History Month this year is the power of social movements. And this conversation is a continuation of what we started at the beginning of this academic year. Each event this month seeks to facilitate meaningful conversations about the Black experience in the United States and around the globe, including social movements demanding equality and social justice. Tonight's conversation will be a bit of a history lesson in an effort to provide greater context for understanding not only where we are at this moment in time, but how we got here, and more importantly, how do we move forward? Our hope is that tonight's conversation leads you on your own journey to seek greater truth and understanding, but that you also remember to intentionally bring others into the conversation. We purposely open up our Black History Month events because we want you all to engage in public discourse about issues that impact all of us. Elena Beverly will be joining us this evening as our moderator, and during the conversation, you should absolutely feel free to start dropping questions in the Q&A because we will have time to get to some of those at the end of the program. Elena Beverly serves as the Assistant Vice President for Urban Affairs in the University of Chicago's Office of Federal Relations and the Office of Civic Engagement. In this role, she shares the university's research, scholarship, and models of urban investment with federal policymakers and national partners. Prior to joining the University of Chicago, Elena served as the Associate Director for the White House Office of Urban Affairs as a member of the Obama administration. Elena serves as a frequent commentator on MSNBC, where she provides insights on issues of race and electoral politics. Elena graduated from Stanford University, and she's a proud Wolverine, having a law degree from the University of Michigan. Tonight's featured speaker is Jelani Cobb, who joined the journalism school faculty at Columbia University in 2016. He has contributed to The New Yorker since 2012 and became a staff writer in 2015. He is the recipient of the 2015 Sidney Hillman Award for Opinion and Analysis, writing and writes frequently about race, politics, history, and culture. He was most recently an associate professor of history and director of the Africana Studies Institute at the University of Connecticut, where he specialized in post-Civil War African-American history, 20th century American politics, and the history of the Cold War. Dr. Cobb is also a recipient of fellowships from the Fulbright and Ford Foundation. He is the author of The Substance of Hope, Barack Obama and the Paradox of Progress, as well as To the Break of Dawn, a freestyle on the hip-hop aesthetics. His articles and essays have appeared in The Washington Post, The New Republic, Essence, Vibe, The Progressive, TheRoot.com, and his collection of The Devil and Dave Chappelle and other essays was published in 2007. Born and raised in Queens, New York, I have followed his career for many years, and I am so glad to be a witness to his amazing gifts. It is such an honor to welcome my fellow Howard University alum, as well as my fellow Rutgers University alum. And without further ado, Dr. Jelani Cobb.
So thank you, Michelle, for that introduction. It's good to be in the company of my fellow Bison and my fellow Scarlet Knight. I'm happy to be able to talk with you all this evening, particularly given the fact that it is the month of February. I always start these conversations by saying that Dr. Carter G. Woodson is one of the least heralded or under-heralded figures in American history, despite his astounding contributions to the field of history itself. And in his work creating Negro History Week, and then eventually Black History Month, he was strikingly prescient about the necessity and the vital urgency of studying the history of Black people in this country, not simply as an exercise in self-esteem boosting or the accruing of random knowledge, but as a vital undertaking for the preservation and protection of democracy itself. And so I want to talk a little bit about that this evening, and to talk about the context of history and what it says and how it enlightens us about the current circumstances that we are operating under. And those circumstances are troubling. We should be very clear about that. Just this week, we have seen the Supreme Court allow Alabama laws that districting plans that disadvantaged Black voters to remain intact, which was a harbinger and at the same time completely in accord with what we have seen in other developments. We have re-embarked on a McCarthyite era of book banning. We have seen a reflexive and limbic attack upon a false doctrine of critical race theory, or something being referred to as critical race theory, and seeing legislation in 19 states that has impacted the ways in which history can be taught, or the way in which racial subject matter can be broached and approached. The irony, of course, here is that this is, for what critical race theory actually is, this is entirely in accord with what critical race theory says would happen. And so it's a kind of ironic validation of the theory itself about how race is operated in institutions in American society. And we've seen the rollback for almost 10 years now from the 2013 Shelby v. Holder decision, the event that eviscerated the Voting Rights Act, a steady accretion of laws that have made it more difficult and more onerous for people to access the ballot. And so tonight, I just want to talk a little bit about the ways in which these dynamics and these developments echo previous moments, and what we can take from those moments and what they have to teach us. So in January of this year, we witnessed, January of last year, we witnessed two astounding developments, neither of which anyone thought would happen, reasonably expected to happen within their lifetime. The first was that the state of Georgia elected two Democratic senators, the first Black and the first Jewish senators from that state in the history of the state. And for observers of Georgia politics, or people like myself who lived in Georgia for 12 years, it seemed as if there was a Republican stranglehold on the state that showed no signs of relenting anytime in the near future. But that happened as a consequence of a growing demographic tide of change. Two things can be contributing factors here. One was the sleeping giant of African American voters, many of whom had not been organized, many of whom had not been registered, and the hundreds of thousands of Black votes that could be, with the proper incentivizing and the proper organization, be turned into an actual demographic force. The other was the growing tide of immigration into the state, both people coming from other parts of the United States and people coming from abroad to the state. There's a growing Latino population. There's a growing Asian American population. And all of those people could be mobilized to vote. And so we saw a change. What appeared to be a state that was solidly one way was in fact teeming with all of these dynamics that were just waiting for the right moment to emerge. And they could make a political transformation. The other thing that we saw in January of that year was the insurrection, the attack upon the United States Capitol in the service of a disgraced president who lost an election and was desperately seeking any means, extra legal or even anti-constitutional, anti-democratic, of maintaining power, that he would hold on to the office of the presidency, even if it meant the demise of American democracy. And having issued these marching orders, we saw people take to the streets and enact violence against police officers in the Capitol, and with the threat of enacting violence against sworn, seated members of the United States Congress. And so, looking at this, as those votes began to roll in November and then again in January, and we saw the areas that were most closely being watched, particularly Fulton County in Georgia, the hub where the disproportionate number of voters, Black voters, who were centered in and around the city of Atlanta, where it was expected to be the determining factor in who would win the Senate seats and who would win the presidential election in that state. And as I watched those returns, I thought again about the circumstances under which Black people first gained the right to vote in the South. It's significant that we revisit the dynamics that led to the passage and ratification of the 15th Amendment in 1870, which gave the right to vote to Black men. In the famed Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858, pitting Stephen Douglas against Abraham Lincoln, I'm aware that now Republicans have revised history to say that it was Frederick Douglass versus Abraham Lincoln, which I don't really understand how that could work, given that Stephen Douglas was defending slavery. And so I guess, Frederick Douglass is still doing things and getting much more attention for them and all those other things we learned. But in any case, in that 1858 debate, Lincoln himself responded to Stephen Douglas's allegations that he wanted to create racial equality by saying that he had no intention of making voters of Negroes in places where they were not already allowed to vote, that he intended to extend citizenship, but not suffrage, to the Negro voter. By the end of his life, by the end of the Civil War, he had come around to the decision that there had to be some sort of suffrage in the South, that there had to be Black suffrage. And he didn't know what that might look like. At first, he thought about confining it to Black former soldiers. And then, he had another kind of vague allusion to restricting the franchise to, quote, very intelligent Negroes. But he was grappling, awkwardly albeit, with the idea that there had to be Black suffrage in the South. It was very clear. The predominant concern of Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party in the aftermath of the Civil War was to not allow the South to regain the disproportionate political power it had in 1860, the power that had allowed it to nearly tear the country in half. This was a consequence, that disproportionate power was a consequence of the Three-Fifths Compromise, which allowed them to count 60% of the enslaved Black population, which in 1860 amounted to 2.4 million people, so that the 5 million whites of the South had the political power of 7.4 million white people. And in order to prevent that state of affairs from resurrecting itself in the aftermath of the war, there needed to be a bulwark against Southern political power. And the reasoning, correctly as it turned out, was that if Black people were given the right to vote, they would vote overwhelmingly for the party of Abraham Lincoln, the Republican Party, the party associated with emancipation. The reason that the enfranchisement was structured in the way that it was, giving the right to vote to men, Black men, and not Black women or not women of all races, was a simple political calculation. The end of the Civil War, there were hundreds of thousands of dead white men. And there were more women in the South than there were men. The fear was that if women were enfranchised, white Southern women would vote just as their husbands, brothers, and albeit deceased relatives would have, and that the South would be even more powerful in 1865 or 1870 than it was in 1860. And so we can distill all this history down to the simple statement that in 1870, Black people were given the right to vote in order to offset the power of a white supremacist movement that threatened to destroy American democracy. And so in 2020, as we watch those elections come in, those returns come in, and in early 2021, as we watch those Senate returns come in, we were witnessing an echo of history, particularly as it became increasingly clear that Georgia would determine, or could possibly determine, who would win the presidency. If Georgia did not go blue, then the revanchist forces of white supremacy as embodied by the Trump administration would have continued to steamroll across the country. Once again, Black voters were being placed as the firewall between white supremacy and American democracy. As you know, this state of affairs did not persist. By the end of the 19th century, the rise of a reign of terror, lynching, mob violence, intimidation, other extra legal tactics like poll taxes and literacy tests had combined to reduce Black political participation, to virtually nil. When he gave his 1965 speech, a speech that I wrote about recently in the New Yorker, when he gave his 1965 speech at the conclusion of the Selma to Montgomery March, he gave this speech on March 25th, 1965. Martin Luther King talked about the reasons that Black people had been disfranchised. He said it's tempting to think that this was simply an expression of white supremacist rage, that the violence and the murder and the mayhem that had attended the disenfranchisement of Black people was simply a product of racial animus. But he said that was an oversimplification, that there had in fact been a motive, an additional motive, that the Bourbon or elite forces of the white South recognized that the biggest obstacle, the biggest barrier preventing them from presenting and executing a policy vision that would disadvantage all poor people across racial lines was the presence of a large and largely progressive Black voting bloc. And so, in looking at the South in the first half of the 20th century, the lags in economic development, the lags in education, the lags in healthcare, the lags in earnings and wages, the circumstance that Dr. Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, described when he said the South does not simply have a terrible segregated school system. In fact, it has two school systems, one of which is bad and one of which is horrible, because it can't afford to have two separate school systems. And that the only chance and only option for creating an actual functional school system would be to have one that served all students equitably. But this state of affairs was able to come into effect by the elimination of Black people as a voting bloc. And so, when we look at the assault on the edifice of disenfranchisement and the multi-year effort that went into creating a Voting Rights Act, we see that much more was riding on this than the simple question of whether the United States would be a fully inclusive, multiracial democracy. By 1965, when the Voting Rights Act is passed, ratified, it comes in conjunction with the 1965 Immigration Reform Act. And those two things, which radically changed the demographics of the American electorate by including Black people throughout the South, and gradually, eventually changed the demographics of the United States by allowing immigration from Latin America, from Africa, from the Caribbean, from Asia, from places that had largely been prohibited previously by American immigration policy, are the main ingredients we see in the crisis that we are now grappling with. And so, it seems almost predictable that in the context of the first Black president, in the context of a multiracial movement of voters that placed that Black president in office and then reelected him 4 years later, it seems almost predictable that we would see precisely the type of reactionary and revanchist political movements that now threaten American democracy once again. So I think there are a few things that we should keep in mind about this and what we can learn from these previous movements. The first is that these movements, these struggles, are protracted ones. We have tended in our examination of this history to look at the high watermarks, to talk about voting rights in 1965, to talk about the struggle for integration in 1954, to talk about the assaults on the edifice of slavery in 1861 to 1865, or in the Emancipation Proclamation. But in doing so, we have tended to overlook all of the years, the fallow years that preceded those developments. We overlook, in emphasizing the Montgomery bus boycott, we overlook the dozens of people prior to Rosa Parks who refused to give up their seats and who were arrested, or the fact that several years earlier, Rosa Parks had refused to give up her seat and been arrested. And so we're looking, as the late scholar Derek Bell talked about, for those moments of confluence where pre-existing movement coincides with a large societal interest that creates a moment that can catalyze change. The other, I think, that we have to be mindful of is the necessity of broad-based allyship. The movements that we have seen that have been successful have brought together people for many reasons, not all of them necessarily moral. The Republican Party of 1860, the party that eventually became so closely associated with emancipation, was an amalgam of people, not all of whom were racially progressive, but all of whom saw an economic necessity for curtailing the expansion of slavery. And this allowed for a moment in which circumstances would push for slavery itself to meet its demise. And the final point that I'll say is that it is crucial, it's absolutely necessary that we maintain in moments of difficulty a sense of realistic optimism. When I say realistic optimism, I mean not the kind of cheap optimism that we tend to peddle in American society, where we look in the face of tragedy and respond with the anodyne words, "It will be okay." I mean the kind of optimism that is realistic, that understands that things are not necessarily okay, and that they may turn out to be even worse. But the optimism lies in the sense of survival and the ability to transcend the moment. As I typically say, yes, I'm an optimist, but I have the optimism of a boxer in the late rounds, meaning that you have absorbed a lot of pain and a lot of difficulty, but if you're still on your feet, there's still a chance that you can win. I think these things are vital, and there are lots more things that we can talk about in the question and answer session. I look forward to getting into that conversation now. Thank you.
Hi, Jelani.
Hi.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much for being with us. That was so rich and full of depth. For our viewing audience, I'm Elena Beverly. I'm an Assistant Vice President for Urban Affairs based in the Federal Relations Office of the university and under the umbrella of the Office of Civic Engagement. And in case this conversation goes there, I just want everyone to know that I've known you for a number of years from the time I was an early attorney at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund trying to champion voting rights. And you have always been such a voice that I've admired in the way that you weave together our issues of race and politics, history and culture, and the way that you share truths that are hard to hear in many instances, but are so necessary for our growth. And so it's just a delight to be with you. So thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Let me take you back. So let's talk more about the origin story of Black History Month and Carter G. Woodson. What was his intent, his leadership and his intent to get the world to confront these very important truths about African Americans in America? I'm thinking about the quote where he said we should emphasize not Negro history, but the Negro in history. Can you reflect on that a little bit?
So, I mean, Dr. Woodson was astounding, and I'm constantly humbled by his example. You know, his parents were slaves. You know, he was born just 10 years after emancipation, and, you know, 10 years after the 13th Amendment. And he didn't start high school until he was 21. And despite that late start, you know, he went on to become the second person after W.E.B. Du Bois, the second Black person to earn a PhD from Harvard. And not coincidentally, both of them earned their doctorates in history. And I think that he understood that there had to be an academic battle. You know, as I always said, that he spent his entire life engaged in a pitched battle against white supremacy, his primary weapon being the footnote. And in the course of this, he realized that it could not simply be a battle to refute the ideas of the scholarly community, that this information had to be made public, that it had to be made accessible to people. And so Negro History Week, which began in 1926, came about, you know, as at the behest of teachers. Actually, one of the things that Carter G. Woodson did that was innovative at that time was that he forged strong relationships with elementary and secondary school teachers, which, by the way, if you know, I happen to be a member of the organization he created, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, and that's one of the things that distinguishes ASALH from other scholarly organizations to this day. That you are as likely to interact with high school and middle school teachers at that conference as you are scholars and PhDs and graduate students. And so he was really diligently trying to make this point that in this grand tide of history, Black people had a contributing role, and thereby undermine the logic of white supremacy saying that Black people had been ciphers, that had been non-factors in the tide of human history. And so he was making that case by saying the Negro in history and not simply the Negro history as a history of the Negro as Negro.
But then to that point, we seem to be, and you've mentioned this both in today's presentation and also in several of your New Yorker articles about the ways in which we're in a period of contraction and where the organized right seems to want to disremember or whittle down the contributions of African Americans in our history. So what needs to happen to ensure that American students are actually taught our U.S. history in a way that's accurate for Black folks?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a difference now because, you know, there was really a stranglehold, you know, on the means of communication in Dr. Woodson's time. You know, we have, you know, broken that. We have access to all manner of outlets to promulgate these ideas and to expose people to these ideas. Now, there also have to be political fights in these state legislatures and in these school boards. One of the things I think that's been under recognized is the extent to which Black school board members have been subject to harassment. That's something that's happening in Georgia now, and in a number of other cases. Brian Kemp, who's the governor of Georgia, cut his teeth politically by prosecuting Black women who had become, for the first time, the majority in a local school board in Georgia. And so we've seen these conflicts take place long before the critical race theory canard emerged. This was going on. And so those battles have to be fought on the local level at the same time that we can promulgate these ideas, in books, on the internet, in podcasts, and all these different formats to get around, the monopoly that people currently have on how things can be taught in particular states.
Yeah, that's interesting. So now activism can also include simply truth-telling, and there are several mediums to do it, right? Okay, well, so now you raised what's been at the forefront of my mind, which is the attack on our civic participation, the attack on voting rights. You talked about the proliferation of voter suppression bills, the failure to pass legislation at the federal level. Now we're seeing redistricting, and that being pernicious redistricting, discriminatory redistricting being, rubber stamped by the Supreme Court. So what do we do when the traditional halls of justice, or our traditional avenues, the halls of justice, the halls of Congress, are failing to protect voting rights? How do we advocate for change when those halls are closed to us?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things that I take from observation of these movements is that they farm during the fallow times, and I mean, obviously, we saw this in the right when we looked at that Gaines v. Canada case in 1938, where Charles Hamilton Houston and his protege Thurgood Marshall began the work of trying to dismantle segregation. There was not a Supreme Court in place that would have favored any argument that they presented, and it wasn't until 16 years later that Brown versus Board of Education was able to prevail after World War II, and in the midst of the Cold War, and all these this confluence of global currents that made it possible for those things to happen. So I think that that's part of it. It's a matter of working in all these avenues simultaneously. The other thing that I think is crucial is that when we looked at the movements that were successful, they were well networked. When we looked at the desegregation movement in Montgomery and the Southern Civil Rights Movement, and the networks people created, for financial assistance, for logistical assistance, for legal assistance, that were national and international. I think that is crucial, and this is also something that the right has observed. I think a lot of the right has observed the history of the civil rights movement, and there's this saying I always have reiterated. Santayana said, "Those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it." And I said, sometimes we repeat history precisely because people learned from it. People who were trying to reenact the worst parts of history, well, they study history as well. And so I think that that's how we have to reclaim the history of these social movements and what has allowed them to be successful.
Well, I'm struck that you say farm during fallow times, because I see so many parallels, and you and I have spoken about this, so many parallels between what we are seeing today and the retrenchment of civil rights and justice, and parallels to what happened at the turn of the 19th century and reconstruction to Southern redemption. So take just a minute to expound upon that.
Yeah, I mean, and in response to the same things,
Yeah.
As I mentioned about immigration, kind of coinciding with this, one of the things that we have not talked about or thought about enough is that movement to eliminate Black people from contention and the segregation that would prevent Black people from voting I mean, it was racist, yeah, but it was also political, that they enacted these laws in places where Black people constituted the biggest portion of the population.
Right.
And you know, people who could sway the direction of a vote. You know, W.B. Du Bois, you know, famously wrote in his autobiography about the moment at which he realized he was Black. You know, he grew up in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, where there were virtually no Black people. And, you know, a child who was from the South was in his class, and she said something, and then it dawned upon him that there was this thing, as this great dramatic moment. And the reason that he can frame it in that way as a great dramatic moment is because he was in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. Had he grown up in Mississippi, he would have had that realization a lot earlier.
Not earlier, right?
And so, and you know, the fact of it is that there was a need to restrict Black people from participation precisely because they were this potent political force, right? And so, by the end of the 19th century, this tide of you know, segregation and disenfranchisement is not simply content to remove Black people from contention, political contention. They also want to prevent more Catholics from coming into the country in the beginning of the 20th century. They are opposed to immigration, generally speaking. They are anti-Semitic and hostile to Jews. There is a kind of broad consensus of contempt that they hold. And it is all around this idea of who is in and who isn't, and maintaining the purity of the electorate. Well, this is the same sort of echo that we have seen. You know, Barack Obama in 2008 was to them what Reconstruction was in 1876. You know, when they were looking at these state legislatures, and 600 Black people voted into these legislatures in the aftermath of the Civil War. And for them, that felt like the apocalypse. You know, that
Black folks in power all over the place. Yes. We are now, right? I'm sorry. Did you have more you wanted to say?
No. You broke.
Because I wanted to ask you. I wanted to ask you more about the context then. So, yeah. You've spoken to a bit about how context matters for where we are with voting rights. You've also, I know you also helped to publish a new version of the 1968 Kerner Commission, right? So speak a little bit about the importance of the Kerner Commission. What was its relevance in 1968? You know, this is what LBJ put together the commission to investigate what was the cause of the riots in the late 1960s. And it's typically heralded as being something that acknowledged that white racism helped to propel the riots, but it also had some really deep-seated devastating approaches to security and police force and the policing of Black bodies. So talk to us about the report and its implications.
Yeah, so the Kerner Report was a kind of fascinating moment, you know, in this 20th century reform, like the last gasp of mainstream racial liberalism as we understood it. And you know, it was never intended to be what it was. As a matter of fact, if you've seen the film 12 Angry Men and how it walks you through the process of deliberation and how people wind up in a place at the end of that movie, the jury winds up at the end at a place that they hadn't conceived of at the beginning. And that's really effectively what happens with the Kerner Commission. This was a group that was appointed by LBJ in 1967 in the aftermath of the uprisings they saw. You know, Watts, 1965, Newark in 1967, Detroit, 1967, Cincinnati in 1966. You know, and actually, it's 24, Paterson, New Jersey. There were a bunch of these incidents that seemed to share a similar social DNA. And he wanted to get to the bottom of it. And LBJ, quite frankly, thought that this was the result of communist provocation. And so he appoints this committee, 11 people who were, of the 11 people, 9 of them were white, 10 of them were men. And they were bipartisan, a very moderate crowd. And what happens is that they begin to go out and do field work interviewing people in these places. And that is what sends them in this direction of writing this report that was so fire-breathing in its condemnation of racism and the implications of racism that LBJ refused to acknowledge that the report existed. And this was his own commission, people who he appointed. It said plainly that the ghetto was a creation of white racism, that white people abided by it, even if they tend not to remember that this was the creation, their own creation, but Black people never forget it. And it talks about policing as being one element of a much broader network of racial inequality. And that is through education, through healthcare, through employment and unemployment, through every institution that Black people come in contact with. And this report was released about 3 weeks before Martin Luther King was assassinated. And so it existed in this moment, especially in the tumult and turmoil of 1968, in a year that Richard Nixon became the president, as the last moment of reckoning with what had happened racially in America. And of course, Nixon takes all of these questions, throws them out the window, and responds with a simple slogan, law and order.
I see parallels to today, or at least, very least, to our former president. One of our professors and the executive director of our health lab, the U Chicago Health Lab, often refers to the Kerner Commission, the report, and elements of that report that actually tried to suggest that police should be used in greater numbers more quickly, and it became the origins for our 911 system to try to suppress a racialized response to or racial unrest. So there were parts of it that certainly,
that's true. And there's also, so there are these currents in Kerner in the report. One of which is a huge section called "Policing During Riots, During Unrest," and that's where that suggestion comes in. But it's a mixed bag, because at the same time, they make a statement. There's a section where they say that people in the ghetto, and they use the term that people use at that time, people in the ghetto have too much contact with police, that police are there for every reason, and that there needed to be alternate social structures that could handle community needs as opposed to simply the police, because every interaction with the police had a chance of going wrong. That was exactly what the defund people were talking about in 2020 and 2021. And we see exactly that.
And now social scientists are doing their best to try to gather that data where there is, where the 911 system is engaged, and we're seeing police officers deployed for things like truancy and homelessness and so on, that are resulting in very dangerous situations. Talk to us about the role of data, because at the Harris School of Public Policy, the students are informed and engaged about the processes of using data to try to transform society, to try to create change. Speak to us a little bit about your perspective of the role of data in social movement building, and in deconstructing some of the systems of inequity that we're experiencing today.
Yeah, I think that this is important, because especially important now, because we've entered this post-truth era, and with this era, as I refer to it as the era of a la carte reality, where you can just simply accept the parts of the real world that you like, and reject the parts that you don't. And as a consequence, we've seen what the consequences of that have been. And so it is important that we have a bedrock of empirical fact and empirical knowledge and data that's been gathered about the nature of our social problems. The pandemic was horrible. It was a plague. It has been a plague. It has been a burden. It has been a blight. But one thing that it has also done is generate a huge amount of data, that the nature of the problems that we're confronting have been illuminated in ways that were obscure, or rather I should say obscured previously. when we began looking at who is categorized as an essential worker and what those people look like, where they're from, the number of those people who are not documented in major cities, what labor actually does the heavy lifting of keeping cities running, who was infected in what numbers, who died in what numbers, and all this information that we had to surmise or kind of do guesswork around. Well, we now have a statistical portrait of vulnerability in the United States. And so whatever it is that we do or fail to do, there won't be an excuse for saying that we didn't have the information available to us to understand that. And so I think that, there's a crucial role for that, especially in people who are working in public policy and people who are working in related fields.
Okay, so I'm going to take a couple of questions from the audience. I know we only have a few minutes left. Okay, I see one about how to address inequality. So what are your best recommendations for how we approach this now, whether it be in the streets or in the courts or on the Hill? How do we address inequality?
I mean, I think that, interestingly enough, Fred Harris, who is the sole surviving member of the Kerner Commission, who's 91 or 92 years old, and I had the opportunity I flew out to Albuquerque to interview him in the fall and had lunch with him. And kind of once a politician, always a politician. He's a former senator, and I had lunch with him, and I was like, is this guy running for something? Like, I would vote for him now, kind of thing. But he took an interesting turn from Kerner. Kerner was so widely dismissed and so widely assailed that he recognized there was a need for a broad buy-in. And that's where he went to kind of broad American populism when he ran for president in 1976. That, I think, is the only reasonable expectation, only reasonable chance we have of addressing inequality. Because we have this kind of racial boomerang effect and a kind of racial zero-sum logic that the difficulties of building multiracial, cross-regional, cross-generational alliances around common cause issues is crucial. It's the only way that we can understand the language of deprivation and inequality.
That's how Georgia worked.
That's how Georgia, exactly. And it's a template. But I also think that when we see the connection between, just as Dr. King was saying, that the most reactionary policies were enacted once Black people were removed from political contention, when we look at things that are broadly popular in this country and don't stand a chance, like family leave, these things that are not happening, and ask yourself, are they more or less likely to happen if Black people are reduced in their political efficacy? And I think just realistically, the argument that has to be made, even though I'm very ambivalent about making it, but we have to illustrate the extent to which disenfranchising Black voters necessarily disenfranchises millions of white people. The white people who voted for the same candidate that the Black people would have voted for had they been able to access the ballot.
Well, okay, well then speak to us a little bit about the ways in which journalism can feed into this, and even your inequality project, and talking about the dynamism of inequality. How can being informed about the various pillars of inequality and speaking to them regularly, so that it is not simply about the plight of Black folks, but also an understanding of how it affects all Americans. Talk to us a little bit about that.
So with the work that we're doing at the Lipman Center here at Columbia, I've been thinking about, I exist in these two worlds as a historian and as a journalist. And
at least two. Tell the truth, at least two,
right. Like those two groups of people don't talk in the way that they should. And so what we're doing here is journalism that is heavily informed by social science. And we have looked at issues of inequality. In this instance, we're looking at racial inequality. This project came out of the death of George Floyd, and we picked 5 arenas: healthcare, housing, economics, education, and criminal justice. And we got teams of scholars and said, can you distill what your field knows about inequality in this particular area into a 50-page report? And this is, what have the scholarly currents been? How has inequality in this field changed and evolved and developed over the course of time? And what do sociologists think about healthcare inequality? What do political scientists think about criminal justice inequality, and so on? And then those reports become the basis for 5 teams of journalists to go out and look for the contemporary applications of this information. And so we're trying to change the parameters of this conversation around inequality to saying, like, there's the very tentative, some people feel kind of approach to journalism. But we want there to be the kind of clarity and efficiency and understanding that social science can provide.
An evidence-based approach to what the problem is that
Right.
can be addressed. Okay, wonderful. So then that's exciting. Please keep us posted about that.
Thank you.
So a question from one of our friends in the audience is, what do you consider to be key approaches and tactics from the Georgia voting rights battle in groups like Fairfight that might be scalable at the national level? And I think you've spoken to this a little bit, but as we're thinking about, maybe just extrapolate from that to the attacks on voting rights on a state-by-state basis. Is there an ability to engage across intergenerationally and interethnically to fight back against these attacks?
Sure. I mean, I think that some years ago, the Reflective Democracy Campaign did that study that showed that white people are about 61% of the population. I think it's 63% of the population, but they hold 91% of the political offices in the United States. If you looked at every single elected office in the United States, white people are vastly disproportionately represented in them. And people of color, however you construe that term, about 37% of the population are squeezed into about 10% of the political offices. And so I think that has to be key, because there are all of these constituencies that are not organized. And that's one thing that Stacey Abrams knew, that people were in Georgia. But there's a kind of presumption that it's silly to go out and organize people. The people who don't vote aren't ever going to vote. These people are not motivated. They can't be won over, et cetera, et cetera. And that logic of pessimism or even cynicism only yielded more of the same. And so more of the same problems that we had seen before. And so I think that has to happen. At the same time that that's happening, there are obviously these obstacles and roadblocks that are being thrown up, like the laws we saw in Georgia, making it illegal to give somebody water, or making it illegal to give people food, as they have these absurdly long lines that are meant simply to discourage voters from coming out. Now, I will also say that on the other side of this is that the Democratic Party, really has a sword of Damocles over it, because you cannot simply, in election cycle after election cycle, come out and say the future of democracy is at stake. We need you to come out in disproportionate numbers like you've never done before.
Every election cycle, every single one.
Right, because people have done that. And it then raises the question of, well, what exactly are you doing once we do that on your end? Which is a reasonable question.
Okay, well, I'm going to end on a political question. My understanding is that you are one of Trevor Noah's favorite big thinkers, favorite thought leaders. And you had an interview with him that I saw where he asked you how you would rank or what your reflections are on the Biden administration. And now that we are 1 year in, we're looking toward year 2. We've seen some important gains. And we've seen some critical losses. And then we also have potentially a Black woman Supreme Court justice coming on the bench. We got a lot going on. What are your reflections on where we stand politically with this administration at the helm? How about that?
I mean, quite frankly, I just would say like this, where we are right now is like a B minus, because I'm not sure there has been the urgency associated with, what we are looking at. Now, there are things with Manchin and Sinema are difficult and those are intractable. But maybe you do pack the Supreme Court, or maybe you do like maximize or use, even with the relative lethargy that his Department of Justice, and of course there's separation there, but the relative lethargy that his Department of Justice has deployed in any array of these circumstances, not the least of which is January 6th. So I hope that Black voters flocked to him because they thought he was moderate enough to get elected, quite frankly, that white people would vote for him. And the problem with that is that he may be too moderate to actually get the things that are necessary and that are at this point essential to the preservation of democracy here.
Okay, it was my fault for leaning you down the political road. Do you have 2 sentences for what our students should feel hopeful about before I turn it back over to Michelle?
Oh, absolutely.
You said realistic optimism.
Realistic optimism. And everything that you look at, the fact that the biggest struggles are behind us, that people, this is Black History Month, and we're looking at people who really had no empirical, reasonable expectation that they would ever defeat the regime of slavery, but who persisted in that pursuit across the span of centuries. And everything else looks attainable in the light of that. And the social movements, we said we wanted to talk about social movements, but every freedom that we enjoy, whether it is the enfranchisement of women, whether it is the child protection, the labor, protections from child labor, whether it is the workplace safety establishments that we have, whether it is the 8-hour day, whether it is the standards for the cleanliness of the environment, and the protection from carcinogens and all these things that are incomplete and insufficient, but they exist in some form because there were people who saw past the exigencies of the moment to the possibilities of the future. And I think that that's what we have to keep in mind, particularly when we have difficult times in front of us.
Thank you for that, being ready to fight to the bell.
So
with that, thank you, Jelani. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your wisdom, your perspective. And I'm going to turn it back over to Michelle Horowitz to close us out.
Yeah, we could keep this conversation easily going for another hour or two, but I have to thank you both so very much for giving your time and allowing us to be a part of this conversation. I'm looking forward to the day where we're not having to do things on Zoom anymore, and we can actually bring you over to Harris, Jelani, and have more conversations about this, because I can only imagine what's on the horizon for us politically and the things that our students will be engaged in. So thank you very, very much for your time. Elena, we appreciate you as well. I want everyone to, lots of food for thought here, but don't let the conversations end here. This should be the beginning of many conversations that we hope to have here at Harris. Next week, we will be joined with former Mayor Michael Nutter and Valerie Jarrett, talking about, how do we make sense of what's happening right now, and why our movements, why do they appear to be so much bigger right now than they have in the past, and whether or not we have sort of transcended beyond race and it's about humanity, and is that why it's so global? And then we will end with Reverend Otis Moss at the end of the month to sort of close us out and really help us think about this idea of hope. So I want to thank you both again for your time this evening, and thank all of our guests who tuned in, and we will see you all next week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.